Jacob. Um, I'm here with Jacob Rutledge, and we're doing something new. We're asking 5 questions, but before we do that, I want everybody to get to know Jacob a little bit. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm the minister for the church in Dripping Springs, the Dripping Springs Church of Christ, and I've been here for about 3.5 years. Was up in working with the Atlanta Church of Christ before that for 4 years up in East Texas. Graduated from Southwest School of Bible Studies, Heritage Christian University with my BA in Bible. Pursuing my MDiv right now through Ambridge, and have 3 kids, and they're about the only hobby I have right now. So,
Yeah.
that and reading. So,
Well, as you know, there's lots of concern among Christians about millennials and some of the younger generations and what's going on there. And so I want to, ask you a few questions about that. And so, why should the church be concerned about reaching your generation?
I think that's a good question. And when I think about that, the first answer seems a little bit simplistic. But I think the first biblical answer is because they're lost. And the reason I say that is because I think it's so easy for people to kind of have a caricature of millennials, and millennials having a caricature of other generations as well, where we're like, I think a lot of ways that people think of millennials is, might refer to them as snowflakes, or, they use all these terms to refer to the millennial generation and Generation Z. And what that does, though, is it kind of puts people in a box and allows you to objectify them instead of looking at them from a biblical lens, which is that, they're lost individuals with their own particular difficulties and the sins that they are in. And so I think that, of course, that's the number one reason, is because they're lost people, and the church has to view them in that way. I don't think the church can afford to say, well, we can do without millennials, because millennials is, we're one of the largest generations, and and will be the leaders within the coming years, and are already transitioning into that role. And so you can't just shrug them off. I mean, if the church is going to thrive and survive, it has to thrive and survive by saving lost people through the gospel. And this is the new generation that has come up, and one of the major generations, my generation. And we have to learn how to reach out to them. And besides the fact, I think this is going to be something we're going to talk about a little bit later, but these millennials have a lot to offer the church. And the church is hurt when we don't have these younger people like myself in the church using their talents for the glory of God. So I think that's why the church needs to be concerned about it. Number one, because they're lost. And number two is because if we don't have millennials integrated and working for the Lord within the local church, we're really missing out on some things.
Yeah. Well, what would you like older generation of Christians to know or understand about people your age or people younger than you?
Um, I think probably the one thing that I would like older generations to know is, just because we're questioning something doesn't mean we're rejecting it. And just because we're searching and seeking, and I've seen that happen a lot. I've seen it happen within my life. I've seen it happen within the lives of others. People begin to search. They begin to ask honest questions that should be asked. And at times the older generation becomes defensive. And they think that because we're questioning, that we're trying to reject everything that they've done. I know of a a father and a son that I'm close to, and the father is a Generation X, and the son is a millennial. And the son occasionally will say, "Well, why do we do this?" And kind of try and discuss these things, and the father becomes very defensive. And but I think the reason is because he thinks his son is just rejecting everything, when in fact he isn't. He's just trying to search out and seek the truth and find his own faith. And I think it's good for the older generation to understand, and because even though they're older, they have some growing to do as well, just as the millennials do. We have a lot of growing. We have a lot of weaknesses. We have a lot of issues. The funny thing about the millennial generation, there was a study a while back, a couple of studies, and one study said millennials were a generation that had the highest view of self, but the lowest view of their own generation. And to me, that translates to everybody. There's a problem, but it's not me, right?
Yeah.
There's a problem, but it's not me. But anyways, I think that also the older generation being able to discern the difference between apostolic tradition and traditionalism. I think that's a big thing that moving forward, the church has got to be better, do a better job of discerning. Because if we don't, we're not going to engage millennials. They're not interested in traditionalism. Yeah. They are interested in apostolic traditions. They're okay with, interestingly, they are actually interested in historical church traditions that are based within a solid exegesis of the text. I mean, I'm an example of that. I'm very much interested in that. Yeah. But I'm not interested in traditionalism. I'm not interested in passing on traditions that came from the 50s or the 60s that have no basis in Scripture. I have no interest in that. I think they can harm the church, not help it.
Yeah, good. Well, what should the church be doing to reach out to people your age?
Well, that's the $1,000,000 question,
yeah.
Isn't it?
Solve it for us.
Well, let me tell you, man, as a millennial trying to evangelize other millennials, I struggle with this. Yeah. And I have found the millennials that I have studied with, the two biggest things I would say when it comes to reaching out or evangelism, or three biggest things, is number one, authenticity, genuineness. They don't want somebody who thinks that they're perfect or feels like they have to defend some vision or image of perfection coming and lecturing to them. They do want someone who is genuine, who's human, who invests in them, who cares about them, who has the relationship with them. Mm-hmm. Now, they don't mind learning the truth. They don't mind discussing and debating the truth. And I think that's, again, one of those caricatures of millennials that just isn't always true. We recently converted 2 millennials here, and they're just on fire for the Lord. And one of the reasons that they were brought to the church was because they're coming out of the community church movement, and they were tired of all of what they called everything being gray. They didn't like that there weren't any absolutes, that there weren't any lines drawn in the sand, and so they were drawn out of that. Now, that's not always going to be the case, but I also think it's not always the case that millennials don't care about the truth. So you have to have genuine relationships. You have to be authentic with them. You have to be authentic, and the second one was relationships. I think that's a big part of it, is relationships. And then number 3 is hospitality. I think that one of the biggest things with millennials is having them in your home, going out to coffee with them. Hospitality takes different forms, but just being casual with them and spending time with them, having them out for dinner, something like that. And then I do think a big part of it is, as a church, we have to create an environment where people feel comfortable and confident in asking difficult questions and not being shut up every time they're asked those questions, and allowing for some flexibility in certain things, and not in the core doctrines of the Christian faith. But even with those core doctrines, they're going to ask questions, as they should, and the church has to do a better job of answering those questions, and not just a rubber stamp way, but being able to discuss them in a way that engages their intellect, that challenges them, and that seeks them to come to a more biblical understanding of what the Christian faith is. So I would say those are kind of the key issues when it comes to reaching out to millennials. I would also say that some of the things that we sometimes think of would engage millennials aren't always the things that actually engage millennials. As a millennial, and I may be an anomaly here, I'm not really interested in whether or not you have a nice PowerPoint. I mean, it might help, but I'm not really, interested in, being sold a product. And studies have shown that millennials generally turn off when they feel like they're being sold something. I didn't realize that about myself until I read that study, and then I started realizing how often I just completely shut down when I feel like somebody is trying to sell me something. Yeah. And I think we are really putting ourselves in a bad position in the church if we're trying to rubber stamp any evangelistic method, any type of study or anything like that, and assume that it's going to fit millennials, and that we're trying to almost kind of put them in a corner and sell them a product. That's not going to work for millennials.
Yeah. So. Well, when you think about some of these millennials that aren't connected to a church and maybe have limited knowledge of Christianity, what's something that you wish that they understood about the church?
One of the things that I constantly come back to, and this is something that I come back to as I'm studying with millennials, and something when I'm studying with young people, is that what I wish they would understand about the church is the beauty of the Christian life, how Christianity is the basis for true human flourishing, that it is where we find true happiness and where we find true joy. And I'm more convinced of that today than I ever have been, that following Jesus Christ and being a disciple of His is what it means to truly live. I mean, the millennials are concerned about happiness, right? And I think that there's this has always been the case, but of course is the case especially with them, this idea that, well, Christians are just kind of stuffy and they're just trying to tell you what you can't do, when in fact trying to help them to see, there's freedom within obedience, and there's freedom within the gospel, and that genuine happiness comes through the avenue of holiness. We become whole when we are born again within Christ, and we're given this new life. And I think it's important going back to the previous point about how can we reach out to others, I think it's important for the church to really display the joy of Christianity moving forward. And I think joy as an evangelistic measure is going to be a big part of this, to show people we genuinely love being followers of Christ, and that this life that we're living is truly the life that we were meant to live. And I think that that's something I would hope that to get across to them.
Yeah, good. Well, what does your generation have to offer the church?
I think that's I keep saying it's good. All these are good questions, but it really challenges me to kind of look at myself and feel like, what have I offered the church? I feel like one of the main things that we can offer the church is a fresh look on old truths. Not necessarily changing those old truths, but you looking at them in a fresh way. I know for me, growing up in the church as a millennial, one of the things that just kind of naturally came to me was, okay, I see on the surface why we teach what we teach. Baptism, for example. And I believe that baptism is for the forgiveness of sins, immersion, in which we are buried with Christ and we become wedded to Christ. And I knew that growing up, baptism was for the remission of sins, but there wasn't necessarily a deeper theology to that. And so for me, I had this basic truth, but I wanted to go deeper. I wanted it to be something more substantive. And I think that going back to the previous question, another thing that the church needs to offer millennials, and doesn't need to give into these caricatures, is a substantive Christian faith. A faith that has substance to it. That's not fluffy, that challenges them. We need something that does challenge them. And so I think what we can offer is, hey, we agree with some of these Bible doctrines that you're teaching, but let's it's a little bit more complex than that. Let's go a little bit deeper. Let's look at it from a different angle. I also think millennials are very creative, very imaginative, and I've seen some great works that have been done within recent years from millennials. I think of the Bible Project on YouTube. I think that's a great example of millennials using their creative style to get biblical truths across. I mean, I think it's a wonderful example of that. Yeah. Millennials have their weaknesses as well. I think that as generally speaking, as a society or as a generation, they're a little bit more lazy than previous generations. They are a little bit more sensitive than previous generations. But the interesting thing about millennials, and I've seen this within myself as well, is that we're okay with rejecting the norm. Like, we're okay with, rejecting the status quo or rejecting how things have been. That's why I genuinely think that with the millennial generation rising up, and some people are surprised to hear me say this, but I actually think that the pro-life movement and, for example, I think this example of this, I think the pro-life movement has a chance to really grow in leaps and bounds over the next 15, 20 years, because I think the millennial generation is okay with saying, you know what, we're okay against going against the narrative of abortion being, healthy for women, so I think that that's good, I think that, but the church has to realize that that idea of challenging the status quo and that idea of challenging how things have been, that's going to come into the church as well. And we've got to be ready for that. Sure. If we genuinely believe that we have the truth, and I believe that we do, then we have to be willing to answer those questions and those challenges in a legitimate and substantive way. So feel like I got a little bit off course with that question, but
no, I think you covered everything. Well, thank you for taking your time and answering these questions. I know it's been helpful to me, and hopefully it's helpful to others. And others can look for another video next week with another 5 questions. We'll try to do this weekly. So thank you, Jacob.
thanks for having me, Scott.